and sit down at the table with love.
So here we are, we've taken the second cup, and we're moving toward the third cup, and there's a few other elements in between. We're not going to spend a lot of time on them. If you did a full Passover, again, you kind of go into these a bit deeper. The first one is matzah. So this would be the first time that everyone is partaken of the matzah. So there's a prayer for unleavened bread. We won't go into that. You just do a prayer or just remind people why you're having matzah. Take a little piece of it.
Because it says you shall eat no leavened bread.
Yeah.
And
so
part of it.
You'll partake of that, and then we're going to move on to the next thing called moror, which is bitter herbs. And I always have to laugh because I always say bitter herbs. I don't know. But anyway, it's the horseradish. And, you know, just for fun, Christie always has us get really strong horseradish. And some people have never had it, and it's quite an experience. It is experiential Christianity.
Can I just say one thing? I know
Sure.
the teacher in me goes off the rails and keeps going, but the reason for matzah, they're to eat unleavened bread because that night of the Passover, they had to leave in haste. You know, they didn't have time. They just, you know, eat the meal, and the bread didn't have time to raise. It takes 18 minutes, I think, once water is put in flour for a bread to, and so they had to just quickly take their unleavened bread and leave. So it was called the bread of affliction because they were leaving in the night quickly. So
now we take a little bit of this horseradish and
on
you
the
put
matzah.
it on the matzah, and you eat it. And you get a variety of responses to really strong horseradish.
It cleans out your sinuses. This isn't very strong.
No, but it's really ironically, it's kind of a good icebreaker.
If you want a really strong horseradish, get the Atomic brand.
Yeah, that'll be fun. So the next thing is harosis.
Again, we're entering into the experience. You know, the things that engage your senses, you know, it reminds your heart. So it's just a...
Aren't we going to mix the two?
Yeah, you mix the two. The first sandwich, you said.
Yeah, you take a little bit of the horseradish and a little bit of this apple mixture. And this is to remind you of the cement and the hardship of building Pharaoh cities. And again, there's still the mixture with the bitter herbs to remind you of the tears that were shed and the hardship of being there. And you partake. There's probably a prayer somewhere about it, too. Think? Jews pray about everything.
John.
You know. So anyway.
Now we come to the meal, which we're not going to do.
But at this point, people are begging for the meal. The
Matzah-
kids are screaming.
Yeah,
People are
everybody's
starting
crabbing.
to check out, so the meal comes just in the nick of time.
And, of course, it starts with matzo ball soup, which when I get my workbook done on Passover, I'll have the recipe for my mother-in-law, Omi's famous chicken soup.
And then, and just take your time with the meal. This can be a long night, depending on how you do it. You know, just if people have young kids, it's great if they bring them. But if they're super young, you might even have them get a babysitter just so they don't have to check out early. But it doesn't matter. It's a family thing. Got to get used to the interruptions of little children. God doesn't seem to mind.
Okay, so this takes us to cup number 3. And in this session, there's 2 parts to this cup, and they're both, I think, amazing. The things that, you know, God's given us revelation of over the years. So to this time, in this session, we're just going to do the first part, and we'll do the next part of this cup in the next session. But this cup is I Will Redeem You. It's the third cup, and on our card here. And so remember I said in cup number 1 that, again, they're all I wills. They're what God has to do. And I said in cup number 1 that God had a problem. He had this group of slaves, his people, who for 430 years were slaves in Egypt, and they had no aspiration for freedom. And he had to supernaturally produce a cry to even make them cry out so he could answer. Well, in this cup, the first part of this cup, we see that God's second problem was that he does everything legally. And the children of Israel were Pharaoh's legal possession. Somehow he had to transfer them from Pharaoh's possession, from Pharaoh's kingdom and his possession, into God had to take him to himself and transfer him into his possession. So he's, it's that transferring. It says, that he took us from the kingdom of darkness into his marvelous light. Something actually transpired when we got born again, when we literally were ripped out of one kingdom and taken to his. So this is what's happening. Redeem means to buy back. It says in Exodus 15:16 that we are the people whom you purchased. And in Deuteronomy 32:6 it says, is he not your father who bought you? So there's a sense of redemption always means to buy back. And we talked about the whole idea of a redeemer, a goel, in prior sessions, that the goel was the one who had to go in and buy back. Anyway, he redeemed a tribesman who was taken captive. He would pay a sum of money and buy them back. Well, we see in Genesis 47 that when there was famine in the land, first all the people in Egypt they bartered for grain, and first it was their livestock. And then after their livestock was gone and they still needed grain, the only thing left to bargain with was themselves. So it says in Genesis 47 that the people of Egypt, except for the magicians, Pharaoh's magicians, were the only, his priests, or I think they were considered, that everyone else agreed to come in to be Pharaoh's possession as long as they had grain. So legally they belonged to Pharaoh. Now remember that they asked for a 3 days journey into the wilderness, so that's what they had permission to do. And 3 days took them up to, we went through this in the when we followed the journey of the children of Israel with Moses, that 3 days took them to the Red Sea. And when they got to the Red Sea, was on the third day when Moses had the legal right. He probably, not that he cared about legality, but when they looked back and they saw Pharaoh and all his armies chasing them, coming up to the Red Sea. And it was when they crossed through those waters, God supernaturally opened up those waters. And just like in a covenant of marriage, it becomes null and void when the one you're in covenant with dies. Like if John were to die, I would have the legal right to marry someone else. Not that I would, and you're not going to die. But so that's how one contract is considered null and void. So when the children of Israel passed through those waters and they were raised on the other side, and they could look back and see Pharaoh and his armies floating in that Red Sea, it was at that point that legally their covenant with Pharaoh was broken, and now they were free to become the legal possession of God. But it was more than just the transferring from one kingdom to the other. You can leave Egypt, but when we leave Egypt, when we left this world, when John and I got born again, there were things of Egypt, things of the world that we had come into agreement with. We had habits. We had given ourselves to all sorts of, just New Age teaching and, opened ourselves up spiritually to all sorts of things that were in the world. And, even though you're now covered in the blood, there's attitudes, there can be addictions, there can be things that you partook of and came into agreement with that need to get broken off of us. And we discovered that baptism, God showed us as we, it was actually supernaturally that he showed us. I had an experience with baptism, that those things of the world, those principalities and powers that we came into agreement with, whatever they were, that, he can get us out of Egypt, he can get us out of the world, but then God has to get the world off of us. And he gives provision for this. Baptism and communion are the two most powerful provisions I believe he gives the body of Christ. And in the next part of this cup, we'll talk about communion and what it really represents. But in this one is this whole picture of passing through the Red Sea is such a powerful provision that God gives us as believers in Jesus, because it's saying that there's a place to disarm principalities and powers. Pharaoh was disarmed. Until they passed through those waters, he could pursue them. But as soon as they crossed over and were buried in those waters, and Peter, it even likens, our baptism to crossing through those waters. And he's saying, baptism now saves you. And whole denominations have started over that verse in 1 Peter, and to say that until you're baptized, you have to be saved. No, Peter was not, I don't believe he was talking about being saved from hell into heaven. He was talking about another kind of salvation. I believe he was talking about this type of this baptism, this shadow and type, when the children of Israel crossed through those waters, that what they were getting free from was all those principalities and powers that they'd come in agreement with to this world. And, it's interesting because in any kind of a cult, like if you're part of a witch coven and they hear that you've become a Christian, they don't care that when you become a Christian. What they always want to know is, did they get baptized? Because the enemy knows, I think even more than most Christians know, about the power of baptism. Because Satan knows that once you're baptized, he's lost his hold. Until that time, there's almost like a legal right he has to keep pursuing you and trying to pull you back to Egypt. I don't believe he can get you out of heaven when you die. That's not what I'm talking about. But I think until that baptism, there's a place where he can keep trying to pull you back into those things that have power over you. It's the agreement. Agreement has power. And when the agreement is broken, there's something that changes. And we've seen this so many times when people are baptized, that when you know the power of it, I experienced it. It was one of those things that I experienced before I understood what really happened to me. I was a believer about 5 years, and all of a sudden I started having tormenting dreams. And in these dreams were people, men that I'd had relationships with before I knew the Lord, before I met John. And honestly, I hadn't thought about them, in years, since I'd been married, since we'd been born again. Never a thought. I just hardly would remember, it was like they never happened. But all of a sudden I started having tormenting dreams, and I would wake up and feeling so ashamed and like, oh no, why am I having these dreams? And I felt like I was, it just felt horrible. And it was never when I was awake, but night after night I would have these dreams. And finally the Lord said to me, go to your church this Sunday. They had baptisms once a month, and they were having one that Sunday. And he said, go to the baptism, go get baptized. And I thought, yeah, but I was baptized as a new believer. I didn't understand baptism, but at that point I just believed you did it because that's what you were supposed to do. It was just part of being a new believer. You got baptized. But I was so desperate to get rid of this thing. And so I humbled myself, got in the new believers baptism line, and went in the waters. And afterwards, it was completely broken. I was completely free. And then some years later, I realized that that's why. Because I still, even though I came out of the world, I never broke off those agreements, those soul ties that still had me bound. And God wanted me free. It's when, I talked about a Jewish marriage and how the thing they do the night before their marriage is go into a baptismal. They have a mikvah. They get baptized. And I shared with you how Ben and Rebecca, our son and daughter-in-law, did that the night before their wedding. And they do that to break off all the things, all the people that you had any kind of ties with before you got married. Every person you had a crush on, it didn't have to be physical, physical relationship, but even emotionally, any place you gave your heart, or gave yourself physically to another, you buried it in those waters, and it broke off that soul tie, that attachment. And so then at your wedding, it's like you're a newborn baby. You're considered a queen and king on your wedding day, and you get to start fresh with that person you're married. It's such a beautiful thing. Well, it's the same when we come to know the Lord and we get to go through that baptism. When you see that it's a place to do more than just obey, and go into the waters of baptism because the word says to. When you see it's actually a burial ground for those principalities and powers, all the things in the world that you agreed with that had power over you, all the things that were holding you back and kept trying to pull you back to those things. And, there's so many things that believers can't quite get free of. And we had a good example. We had a friend who, during a time at our church when there was a lot of baptisms and the Holy Spirit was really moving, friends of ours came to visit, and Dave, the man, was talking about how for years he had a problem with depression. And for some reason I felt to share with him this principle of baptism. And he had been a pastor for 40 years and had been in missions, and I didn't want to insult him by asking if he'd been baptized. But I said, have you ever been baptized? And he said, no, but I always desired to be. And I think maybe as a baby I was sprinkled. But, God's been pulling on my heart for quite a few years to get baptized. And I said, well, there's a baptism tonight at church. And I explained baptism to him, I said, you don't have to carry this depression with you. You don't have to be in agreement with it anymore. And so we went with him, and he got baptized and got totally set free. It was a principality and power that just needed to get buried in those waters that never was. And John and I have so many, could tell so many stories of, sometimes after I share this at our Passover Seders, people will say, well, I want to get baptized. There's things I never buried, or I never was really understood baptism the first time, or, I just was sprinkled or not baptized at all. There's no shame in that. It's just, they realize that there's a powerful provision, and so they ask to be baptized. And one year, a friend of ours who had just gone through cancer therapy, he was, they said he was cancer free, but he was a rodeo guy, and he liked to rope calves, and his shoulder, after the cancer treatment, he was unable to use it. And he heard this teaching on baptism, and he said, I really want to bury that principality and power of cancer. I don't ever want that to be able to come back and pursue me again. And I want to bury it in the water. So we had a hot tub, and we used it more for baptisms than anything else. But we buried a lot of people in that hot tub. And so, it was nice to be able to be spontaneous after Passover and say, well, let's go do it now. And so, Larry went into the waters, into the baptismal, the mikvah, our hot tub. And, at a baptism, there's witnesses. So we were witnesses, and you want to make sure they're all the way under. And so the first time he came up, his wife said, Larry, you weren't all the way under, your shoulder was up. And so he went down again. And when he came up, his shoulder was totally healed. So, and I believe that was years ago, and he's still doing well and cancer free. And I believe that the power of that principality and power that was pursuing him was broken, and he had no more legal right to pursue him. So the witnesses are there to say, we were there at your baptism. You immerse yourself, and when you come up, the witnesses are there to say, now if that principality and power, if Satan tries to pull you back into that thing, whether it's an addiction or any other thing, the witnesses are there to say, no, we were there and we saw and you were buried, and we proclaim they have no more legal right to your life. So baptism is powerful, and we haven't understood it. But when you understand it in the context of the children of Israel passing through those waters, passing into the Red Sea, buried, it says we're buried with Christ in baptism and raised to newness, raised to new creation. So looking back, seeing principalities and powers, Pharaoh floating in those waters, they not only were free to be God's legal possession, but they were free from those principalities, those things they came in agreement with, all the habits, anything, God will show you what things need to be buried, but they're all taken care of in those waters. Baptism is powerful, and I believe it's a provision for so many of us that just need to be free from things. And sometimes we carry those things, like our friend who had depression. We carry them way too long. So, rush to the waters of baptism, immerse yourself, and apply this understanding of what baptism really is, and we believe you'll be delivered. We've seen so many people delivered in baptism over the years. So that's the first part of this cup. We won't take it yet until we teach on the full, the second part of this third cup is powerful too. It's on communion, the real meaning of communion. So we'll see you in the next session.